I'm Gianina Baker. I am excited to talk today a little bit about what I've titled From Compliance to Empowerment, Leveraging Transparency in Assessment Practice. You have hopefully seen the transparency framework. If not, that's what's on this page. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into how we got to the transparency framework and its uses here today. Just a quick note, I currently work as the Associate Director of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, and also sit as Acting Director of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NILOA. Both are located on the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign's campus. OCCRL has been around for 30 plus years and is one of the very first organizations that have studied community colleges across the country. And NILOA was formed in 2008 by a couple of, one a former president of the University of Illinois and Stan Eckenberry, and George Koo, whom you cannot escape any type of reading in higher ed literature without seeing his name. And so I bring to you today more of the NILOA work, but also know that my talk is informed by what we're seeing in community colleges across the country as well. And so with that, I want to at least start with acknowledgement of a bunch of resources, all of which are located on our page. And if I go back real quick, the website is learningoutcomesassessment.org. Please feel free to jump in, start reading materials, resources while you're at home tonight on a Friday and you want something to, just really get you going. Go ahead, take a look. We have lots of good work from not just us, but many of our colleagues that have written about assessment in different ways. And so I wanted to make sure you had access to the link. And that's where you find all of these resources and more. This is just a small piece of what I'm pulling from, but know that there's so much good work that's out there around assessment, but you'll see evidence of much of that as we continue. And so if you just go back with me, right, prior to say 2008, and think about how assessment was talked about. If you think of it in relationship to accreditation, you can see, and you probably, as you're reading through, see that accreditation was a primary driver of assessment activities. We saw that in many of our reports, especially in the very first one, where we did a landscape survey, trying to understand what assessment activities were occurring on campuses across the country, and then, what were some of the expectations. We also understood that internal drivers of assessment included program review and process improvement, especially at our two-year colleges. Program review is incredibly important. We also saw more of this, right? A compliance view of assessment. So if you look just at that cycle, sometimes, maybe referred to as a vicious cycle, you start to see this compliance approach, right? Where assessment comes from a focus more on external accountability. There are definitely some issues of quality assurance, and you can see that it's mostly a reporting framework. And under this compliance philosophy, often you'll find that faculty and assessment professionals are feeling like this is an overly bureaucratic process, right? It's very time consuming, often feels divorced from teaching and learning, and it's just it feels more of an add-on, right? And often how assessment was viewed. And so if you think about this compliance view and you think about that again, before 2008, you'll also recognize these paradigms. Peter Ewell, one of our senior scholars at the time, wrote this paper where he was looking at the two paradigms, right? One for improvement and one for accountability. And if you think about that compliance view and how accreditation was driving assessment, you'll see it very much closely aligned with that assessment for accountability paradigm. I'm hoping, though, that through the years, you're starting to see an assessment for improvement paradigm from your institutions. And so you'll see assessment that is much more formative, much more engaging, right? That there's multiple feedback loops in terms of using results, and even quantitative and qualitative evidence is gathered, right, to help you understand how you might better communicate and then use those results. And so if we're moving in that way, and if you're seeing that, right, and the ways that we were, after the initial landscape survey, we then started to say, well, how are institutions talking about assessment, right? What are they posting on their websites? And what does the institution really display in different ways, right, regarding student learning outcomes assessment? And so this report was written, and they looked at over 3,000 plus websites as a whole, right? There were a team of 6 researchers that systematically reviewed all of these institutions' websites back in 2009, and they pulled them all from regionally accredited undergraduate degree granting post-secondary institutions. And while it didn't look at if the institution reported results of assessment efforts, that was, those are further studies. It really just looked at, what are on which web pages assessment of student learning located. Where is that information located? And so if you want to go back and really understand how we got to here, this is definitely a really good report to review. And that all led to deciding, what does this transparency framework look like, right? If that initial study looked at a bunch of websites and said, this is what the information, this is what at least institutions were putting on their pages at that time, let's think about how we might provide more of a framework for other institutions to understand what they might provide. And so the framework itself provides guidance to institutions as you try to figure out, right, how will you present learning outcomes assessment on your site? And so you have to take into account the website's purpose, its structure, the intended audiences, your capacity of your technology staff, as well as any other available resources when you're actually reviewing the components. And so when we developed this transparency framework, we decided that we wanted to support institutions in sharing evidence of student learning, both on and off campus. And so as it's based on this review of institutional websites, it does identify 6 key components of student learning assessment. And so we told institutions, as they were starting to use this, right, you can use the framework even to examine your own institutional websites right now to gauge the extent to which you see, and others, maybe other external audiences can see, evidence of student accomplishment. Is it readily accessible? Is it useful? Is it meaningful to each of those audiences? And if not, what information should you be thinking about sharing on those websites? Each section of this framework does, I think, suggest a different component, right, of student learning assessment that hopefully is not just of interest to your internal audience, but also more external audiences. And if done well, really gives us an opportunity to advance public understanding of what's happening on our college campuses. And so the central tenets, pretty straightforward, right? After looking at all these websites, we said we wanted, in terms of website transparency, clarity in language that's understandable, but also specific, right, to multiple audiences, easy to find, that's widely available across the website, accessible by multiple web browsers and in various internet speeds. While I wasn't a part of the initial study, as we continued this work through some of the years, we were trying to find out if you could get to assessment information within 5 clicks. And if you couldn't, where was it located and why? And so when we think about easy to find, is that it's less than 5 clicks to get to this. And many institutions have since done that. It's also the websites itself, that they're updated regularly, right? As you get feedback, whether it's from different audiences, externally, internally, that you're using it, right, to ensure that that information is updated and that it's timely. That's an important piece as well. There are some websites that aren't. But they were at one point, right, and aren't anymore. And so you want to make sure that the information that's there is not at least, more than 5 years old. New students, new faculty, new voices to the conversation that you want to make sure that you're actually addressing. And so with that, as we think about the framework itself, as we think about those central tenets, right, easy to find, timely, relevant, we have to think about how then these components really do provide a set of underlying principles. And so this is, as you see on your screen, are the 6 different components. What I thought I might do today, right, because we've had several webinars that go into each of these into detail, and it's helpful, but we've also been able to work through this. And as I pull from the Excellence in Assessment designation that we no longer house or sponsor, I want to pull in some information and some guiding questions that we actually developed to go along with these components to really push you to think about your own websites and your own student learning outcomes information that you host. And so as we go through, I'll share with you the guiding questions that we asked different institutions to fill out as they were trying to write their narrative around what they were doing in terms of good assessment practice. And so in each of these domain areas, we asked people to look for evidence of certain pieces around their assessment process, and then use that to think about their breadth and their depth of their assessment activities as they were responding. And so to help you better understand the connection maybe between the framework and even that EIA designation that really helped guide institutions in writing their institutional assessment stories, I'll try and go through each of these briefly. So if you look at this first component, student learning outcome statements, this really asks, does your institution have student learning outcome statements that are integrated with co-curricular, college, program, unit, and course levels? We know that from the report that we wrote back in 2018, that over 80% of institutions responded that they had student learning outcome statements at the institutional level. Now, obviously, numbers dropped as you went from institutional to program and program to course level, but it was impressive, right? That when we first surveyed institutions across the United States, there weren't that many institutions that had started that. And so now we're at this space of over 80%. And so it's only grown and gotten better, especially because I know a lot of the conversations that I've been a part of have absolutely asked the question, how are we integrating with co-curricular pieces that, they're able to move a bit further in their conversation, not just stuck at that institutional level. When we think of our student learning outcome statements, right, they clearly state the expected knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and or the habits of mind that students are expected to acquire at an institution. Assessment, if we're intentional about assessing for student success, right, we know that it often begins with specific actionable learning outcome statements, concrete, clear proficiencies that students are to achieve. They can even be reference points, right, for student performances that are common to all undergraduates across all majors. And so the questions, those guiding questions that you see on the screen are there to help you figure out, right? Not just does your institution have those clearly stated shared student learning outcome statements, right? But are those student learning outcome statements permanently posted and communicated to students? Where and how do you do that? And other stakeholders? Are those assessments of student work in courses, programs, and co-curricular activities linked to shared learning outcomes? I mean, it really does push your practice. And we often found that the institutions that were that earned that designation, the Excellence in Assessment designation, were able to share how they were able to do this, right? The next component, assessment plans. We ask here, does your institution have assessment plans across the institution that are intentionally integrated or scaffolded, especially between and among academic and student affairs? Who's been able to bridge between student and academic affairs? We were constantly looking for some really good examples of that. And we're hoping that, since the designation, more and more are able to show how they've been able to do it. And not just say it, but document it. That's what was incredibly important about this process, was that they were writing this down and had to have agreement among quite a few people, different positions, different departments, right, to ensure that this was happening. So we often see that institutional level plans for gathering evidence in student learning might include some institution-wide approaches that hopefully show and convey how student learning will be assessed, what data collection tools and approaches are used, as well as a timeline for implementation. And often the work might build from program level and unit level plans. We saw that quite often with some institutions. Here at the University of Illinois, it's such a large decentralized institution that definitely the institutional level plans bubbled up from those program level plans. But there still should be some level of common assessment activities that are designed to provide evidence of learning throughout the institution. This is just one example that you see from student affairs at Northwestern, but I think a very easy visual to see how everything was connected, right? Now, the harder part is to write that out, really tell your story. So if we move to assessment resources, we ask here a couple of things. Does your institution have a centralized location where faculty and staff can locate resources on assessment best practices? And it might include information on institutional level assessment activities and how they're integrated with program course unit assessment. And we also ask here, have policy and procedures for evaluating faculty and staff, including formal or official supports or recognition of efforts made to improve or advance assessment practices, either individually or as within a program or at the institutional level. Are those also available? Have you thought about that? If not, we invite you to think about that here. So often what we found here was that institutions felt like it was just enough, right, to have that go-to place for assessment on their website. And it's a great start. I even did that when I worked in assessment at an institution. And then it became much more. I think the conversations started to get into, well, okay, that's great that you have a repository of information there, but how are people using it? And then can you package the material in a way that makes sense for different audiences, whether that's contingent faculty or maybe some here at the university teaching assistants? Like, how are you thinking through how you're packaging some of these materials, and do they again use them? We offered, it was a few years ago that we stopped doing it, but for a while we would have institutions nominate themselves or have others nominated to be a featured website. And those are still actually on our site. I will note here, the websites may have changed from what they were, but we tried to capture at least at one point what they looked like. And so we tried to find examples of promising practices in both innovative and transparent online communication of student learning outcomes assessment. And we had some criteria for when selecting those feature websites. One was communication, that the institutional website itself clearly communicated and or presented information on student learning outcomes assessment to multiple or specific internal or external audiences using layperson's language and contextualized examples. We had some really good ones there. We also looked at navigation. Information on student learning outcomes assessment is found on multiple pages across the website and is easy to navigate. And you can find it through a variety of links or search engines, right? That it's just not in one little place that's obscure and you can't, it's so hard to find, right? You have to have really good Google sleuthing skills to get there. And the last criteria was creativity, that the institutional website communicated information on student learning outcomes assessment and the results in new and interesting ways, including integrating multiple measures. So if you go and you find the feature website portion of our website, hopefully maybe your institution's included, but I think what we were really trying to get at in here was not just that you had a place to go to, but that you were really thinking about all of these other components in itself. And that often was at least the start for many institutions to help think through the other components of their framework. The next one was current assessment activities. Now, this is also one that could be heavily populated, especially right now. Everyone is doing something regarding assessment. And so we didn't want you to just throw everything there, right? Oftentimes those assessment activities look like a full range of projects and activities that were either recently completed or maybe currently underway that hopefully helped gauge institution level student learning, right? When we looked at this excellence in assessment designation, we weren't looking at the program and course level. We wanted to look at the institution level because we said that it would inform all of those other pieces, right? Potentially underneath. And so with that, we also wanted to understand how you might be using current assessment activities to make improvements or respond to accountability interest. Here we really ask, does your institution have information on current assessment activities that are easily accessible to various audiences, whether you're on or off campus, including information on how institution level assessment activities integrate with program, unit, and course assessment, and who's participating in all of these processes, right? I love the cartoon that we often use in describing assessment in general. And here I thought it would be most appropriate, right? That part in the middle that says, then a miracle occurs, right? You have that formula at the top and at the bottom. And we know there's so much in the middle. Oftentimes it's this component, it's this piece, right? That's in the middle that we're not really sure about. How are we integrating all those pieces? How are you talking about it? We also, on our website, have tons of assessment and practices from institutions that were describing their assessment activities and how they were trying to integrate. And so I invite you to go and peruse some of those if you're just thinking, if you're trying to find an idea of something different to do. I was just at the Assessment Institute, and I love seeing the different ideas that people are bringing to it, right? You have a background, oftentimes not from assessment, right? Many of us don't have degrees in assessment of student learning, but rather in our backgrounds. So how can you bring that to the assessment space and really push on it? I personally love the one on escape rooms. And I think when I came out to California to present it one time, I got introduced to it there. And so there are many innovative ideas happening where people are thinking about, how can I get others to come into, how can I invite them into the conversation of assessment and thinking through some of those other ways beyond just the standard process of looking at data, evaluating data, oftentimes is what's needed. And so I invite you to continue pushing on those conversations. The next one, the fifth one, is evidence of student learning. This one is, I think, pretty self-explanatory, yet often it was difficult for institutions to document because it required more than just putting the information out. When we say evidence of student learning, it includes results of institution level assessment activities. And that may be evidence of indirect, like a survey, right? Or direct, say a portfolio of student learning, as well as institutional performance indicators, which might include something like licensure pass rates. And so we ask here, does your institution have evidence of how the institution connects dots between the multiple layers of assessment activities occurring within programs, units, courses, and various learning experiences to provide an integrated picture of student learning? Can you tell us what's happening on your campus? Can you give us that big scope of what is happening around student learning on your campus? If you are able to do that, and there were institutions that we were able to see how you were thinking about your results. And here's just one quick example of how an institution, when I was working with Jillian Kinsey, who also was a senior scholar, and at the National Survey of Student Engagement, this was one where she helped share a good example, right, of transparent, understandable outcomes results, right? It's there. Are you able to share that with your institution? And back, and so you can get some good. Oh, you can't hear the sirens. I promise, anytime I present, they're just right there. They must know. But are you able to look at and share results? Is there anything that comes to mind when you look at this that you're like, oh, did we share that information? Should we share that information? Where should we put it? Right, starting to think through some of those pieces is incredibly important. And I think that last question there, right? Who is engaged in the process of collecting, reviewing, monitoring, and compiling evidence of student learning? And that's all of us. but are you, again, then putting it in a place where others can see it? And if not, let's start. Because the last one is use of student learning evidence. And this one really tries to pull together all of the pieces from above, right? And if you don't have some of those pieces, it's going to be hard to really talk about the extent to which institution level evidence of student learning is used to identify areas where changes in policy and practices may lead to improvement, that may inform institutional decision making, maybe some problem identification, planning, goal setting, faculty development, course revision, program review, and even accountability or accreditation self-studies. So we ask here, does your institution have evidence from multiple levels to guide programmatic and curricular decision-making, as well as monitor and evaluate the results of those decisions for improvements in learning? If not, you will find this student journey that was developed by representatives from Kapiolani Community College, a bit hard to look at and to review, but they were able to take much of this evidence and then say, this is how our students experience us. And in fact, here might be some places that, maybe might be some barriers, some pits, like we need to really figure out what it is that they need and help them plan for it. And right in that process, we are improving ourselves. Can you right now today put together a student journey? And there are more examples of what this could look like. When I worked at an institution, we did the Six Sigma process to look at advising. And we're able to find out places where there were stops and where students could stop out. And so we said, we got to do something different. Are you able to do some of that work? Have you done that work? And then not just have you done it, have you documented it? Have you put in something, an intervention, right, that you thought could help improve, and then talked about the improvement? That's what we're really looking here for. And again, there were institutions that were able to do it in incredibly, really, and I think in incredible ways. They were able to understand what student learning looked like at their institution and communicate it. That's what we're trying to get at with the transparency framework. And so with this, you might find institutions everywhere, right? Hopefully using it, but maybe they also used it before and have advanced. We had so many institutions at one point, at least starting with this, because it was a really good place to build on, and maybe have gone and used a different framework. But if you're not sure, what components are needed or what it could look like, you've seen the framework from us. Many institutions have developed it themselves and use their own colors. So you can see examples from Emporia State, Ohio, California State University, Bakersfield. Oftentimes they're clickable. So you could click on assessment plans and it'll go to information there. But we thought it was a really good, while we created it just to help you explain and see what the necessary components are, others then said, can we take it ourselves and then post it to our site and do something different? And so there are still some examples that are out there. I invite you, if you've not thought about using it, to maybe take it and at least start to have a conversation with your faculty, staff, assessment committees to help, again, think through what evidence needs to be at least included, and then you can go and build it in the way that makes most sense for your institution. Now, I found this quote written in this Beyond Compliance report, and they talk about, and it's a bunch of NILOA scholars, they talked about a more consequential approach is to weave together from many different sources evidence that addresses the questions of those on campus who are in the best position to interrogate, interpret, and use evidence of student learning to make decisions to enhance that learning. That's a powerful statement. We consistently are thinking about assessment. Well, those of us in assessment, right? We're always thinking about it. And then we're also thinking, how can we make, or how is assessment consequential, right, to student learning? And I think while it's this article, it wasn't written last year, right? It was written quite a few years ago at this point. It's still very relevant in helping us think through how we move forward. You know, if you think back to that earlier slide around the paradigms of assessment, right? And it had one for assessing for improvement and the other assessing for accountability. You know, what we noticed in 2018 expanded on that paradigm. What we found was that equity, while it could have been before, we didn't ask it in the same way, but we asked, you know, is equity a driver of institutional assessment efforts? And we found that it was. In fact, disaggregating the evidence of learning by various groupings of students was becoming even more important as we are trying to understand our institutions better. And so with that, you know, you started to see a different assessment cycle, right? You saw the compliance view, and now we're at a space of, if we really put students at the center and not accreditation, what could that look like? It's a cycle where, you know, it's student-centered. It's one where we're seeking information about how well our students are learning and how various areas of the college are actually supporting the student experience. That it's not just the classroom where students are learning, but it's everywhere, right? We can really consider student affairs as educators. Students are getting information and learning everywhere. Hopefully, right, it helps us reflect on what we teach or do and how we teach or how we do it. And it gives us some responsibility for student learning and the student experience, as well as lets us experiment with new strategies for student success. All of that is quite possible, right? If students are the primary focus of the assessment process, and hopefully, right, as we're thinking about quality and how it might emerge and the definitions behind that, this is an organic process that has been there. But with the reporting requirements and other things put on us, right, that compliance view is one that drives often the initial focus of assessment. But we can see that we can get here where students are active participants. It's not something that's done to them, right? That it's done with them, that it's formative. There's feedback, it's collaborative, it's adaptive and embedded. There's also this focus on pedagogy, more of a focus on, again, understanding the student experience, maybe informing program improvement. And hopefully in that, we've embedded curricular design and feedback that builds on student agency. I hope you're able to see this assessment process at your institution, or I hope you're building toward it, because it's so much more empowering than the compliance view. And again, allows us to have a different conversation about what we know and what students can do. You know, as we talk about the transparency framework and its primary purpose, right, was helping communicate. We also, in that 2018 report, years after the transparency framework was built, found that communicating effectively about student learning still and probably always will remain a challenge. There's so much to know and to learn about what data we're gathering, but we have to. We have to be clear. We have to be more persuasive. We have to communicate relevant, timely, and contextualized information on our impact to students and values to society. We know this. We continue to get asked, what is the value in higher education and post-secondary education? We have to be ready to answer those questions when asked by a variety of audiences. What we found was that when we asked provosts, because that's who were the main respondents of the survey, what's the most important outcome information to share publicly? Information on accreditation, we knew, right? Retention, persistence, graduation, and completion rates, we knew. Licensure and certification exam pass rates. You know, we've been sharing those as well. Many institutions have been trying to. Job placement and salaries, some of that data is a little bit harder, but of course, everybody wants, you know, that 100% job placement rate, but we knew, right, that was important for institutions to share. And then you see return on investment and costs. Those are incredibly important to share if you have the information. But as you can see, to be able to supply all of this requires integration, requires a lot of additional people in a conversation. And I mean, this could be very burdensome in terms of all of the information shared. So you have to kind of pare it down a bit, right? And so as we had further conversations with provosts about what to share, they started to give us some more information, right? And it was not that it was that what to share wasn't important. We are starting to see more institutions share that on their pages, but it became how to share that information because there was limited publicly available information on their website. So if we think through that, and as we were working with many of the provosts, right, they asked for help about a little bit about what to share, but mostly how to share, mostly externally. And even pushing on that, it was how to communicate a nuanced, complex picture of student learning that couples evidence of learning outcomes with student success data such as persistence and graduation rates. Oof. Okay, well, sure, we're going to help you do that, right? It was much easier to talk about what to share. We had those conversations, and many institutions went straight to it. But then as they developed as they went to this more nuanced conversation, it became, oh, wow. Like when you think of those two, evidence of student learning and use of student learning evidence, you're like, I get it now. I get why that's a bit harder. And let's spend some time thinking through that. There were a couple of gaps also identified. So this provost had said, we can provide all the assessment results or data we like, but if others cannot interpret them accurately, there's no benefit to transparency and accountability. I think many of you could agree with that, as you're out there trying to explain, or hopefully, right, helping people explain what some of this information means. And so we found that, there's this presentation and interpretation gap. There's this gap between audience understanding and assessment evidence, right? If we carry that with us and thinking through how can we better explain or better help people both internally and externally understand what evidence is gathered. We also then need to keep this in mind, right? This is not easy to share in sound bites. And communicating outputs such as employment rates and beginning salaries does not serve as a proxy for student learning and quality of programs. But we need to find ways to help the general public make meaning of the results. Huge. Another not so small task in terms of meaning making. Communicating outputs is not sufficient. Outcome results must be made more meaningful for target audiences. We know this as well. We found that out through earlier conversations, and we felt helped just confirm what it was. And then we're saying, well, what can we do? And lest we wanted to go to every single website and put all their information out for them, and on top of that, help them make meaning with all their audiences, right? Which sounds like a really good job, but also one that I would probably get burnout on. We then said, what could we as an organization do to help other institutions tell their stories in hopefully more meaningful ways? And so the excellence in assessment designation came forward. We felt and wanted to be very intentional that it was to help institutions evaluate the extent to which they were effectively communicating this coherent narrative of institution level assessment of student learning. Hopefully, right, they're communicating their work to various audiences by connecting multiple points of evidence. I like to say that that's what institutions on the other end were able to say they did as a result of participating and just even writing the self-study, whether they earned the designation or not. The Excellence in Assessment Designation program recognized institutions for their efforts in intentional integration of campus level learning outcomes assessment. What we were able to see were that many institutions that earned that designation were able to provide cohesive and concise narratives, talking about their institution-wide assessment processes. And oftentimes, they were able to talk about that interconnectedness, especially when we saw many institutions, again, that were maybe, had current assessment activities or maybe had student learning outcome statements, but hadn't worked toward that next piece of integration. So what was it? What is it? It's still around. Actually, now it's the American Association of Colleges and Universities. They have taken the designation itself. I don't know where they're at in the process. I've seen a few emails go around where institutions are still interested in applying for it. I haven't been in contact with them to see where they are at in the process, but I know they wanted to do some first kind of some listening tours to then figure out how they wanted to go forward. But I'll tell you about what it was. And so it was a national recognition program for campus assessment at 2 levels. We had excellence and sustained excellence. So excellence for some of those institutions kind of just starting out with their assessment process, and sustained excellence for those who had been doing this work for five or more years. And there were many institutions that have been doing that. In fact, were models of assessment for us for years prior that we were able to develop policy statements and other resources from. And so we had to help them earn this designation because we knew that they had been doing some really good work. We based the evaluation off of the transparency framework, which is why I was connecting the guiding questions to the framework earlier, because it made most sense, right? If we're saying that you are transparent about your assessment process, the transparency framework was a great way of helping with that. And now we're trying to push it to the next level. How are you using that to integrate what you're doing? It definitely had a focus on campus-wide assessment and made sure to include student affairs and other external stakeholders. And it was a joint project between us, ACNU, as well as the Voluntary System of Accountability within APLU. So lots of good work created there. We thought that, in terms of creating the designation itself, again, many campuses were successfully designing and implementing institution-wide assessment systems that provided evidence of learning of all students. And most of the time, these systems themselves were horizontally and vertically integrated that encompassed learning both in and outside of the classroom, and were validated by participation and evaluation of external stakeholders, which included alums, employers, and other schools that the students attended subsequently. So by incorporating all areas of the institution, not just those that occur inside the classroom, institutions were able to confidently assert that the competency of their students in areas of leadership and teamwork, that they were essential outcomes for employers in today's diverse workplaces. And so it was intentionally integrated layer systems that rested on the foundational work of faculty in the classroom, where campuses were able to provide deep and rich evidence of students' knowledge, skills, and abilities. We saw that, and we have so many examples still today of what this ideal institution-wide assessment plan could look like. Their assessment activities, right, were connected to their evidence, and then most of all used, right, to improve. So we wanted also just to celebrate. This is hard work. Many of our institutions were trying to, leverage the work that they had done and said, it's not just another add-on. It's not just to do it for accreditation. We're doing it because we know it's the right thing to do. And let's, for a second, just take a step back and celebrate give ourselves a pat on the back for what we have been able to do and where we're going. It was awesome to acknowledge the institutions that had been able to move through the process, because oftentimes even the process itself was a bit hard. And so as they completed the self-study, we said, give yourselves a pat on the back. If you're able to earn the designation, another pat on the back. If not, apply again. Tell us more, work more in certain ways. It got really good feedback. And so as you look through this list of designees, again, I'm sure many of them would love to share their stories with you. There's still write-ups of each of these institutions on our site about, why they were named a designee, whether they were excellence or sustained excellence. but many of them are very much able, if you ever attended any of the webinars, again, those are posted on our YouTube site as well, you'll be able to see how they were just so able to talk about their assessment process so concisely. I mean, it was awesome to watch as they brought in various stakeholders, right? It wasn't just one or two people able to talk about it, but several. Raised hand, go ahead.
Dr. Baker, uh, I'm not sure if you're done, but just had a quick question on the transparency framework. If you can go back to that picture that you have. What's the question? What is the most common?
This one?
Yes, actually
Okay.
the framework. What is the most common difficulty that most institutions have in the process? Either the assessment resources, the student learning outcome statements. Where do they struggle the most?
Oh, for sure, using evidence. I mean, oftentimes the reason the institutions that earned the designation were able to really talk about use. Many institutions were not, and that often um, did not allow for them to earn it. So most institutions, right, you have your learning outcome statements, you have assessment activities, you have all of those pieces, but it's how you're using it to improve. So if you spend any time, it's really around not just the evidence of student learning, but that use of it.
Can you also say about also communicating it to the campus as a whole so they can all know where they're at also?
And if you look in the rubric itself, if you look deeper into some of the questions that we put out there in each of those spaces, especially around, I believe it's evidence of student learning, we ask, how are you communicating? And whom are you communicating to? Because you can put all this, you could do all of this and put it on your website, and again, it doesn't
Mhm.
matter. But when we were reviewing each of the applications itself, we were asking the question, show us how you're communicating and to whom you're communicating, and if they're understanding that information in the way that you're trying to communicate it. And so, absolutely, that was key for many institutions, again, to earn the designation itself. Otherwise, I mean, what's the point? The transparency is making it available that's successful and communicated for sure.
And the other thing also, I mean, you mentioned 80% of the institutions already have this transparency framework, but the resources, there's some struggles with resources, acquiring the resources, as you know, uh, just talking and speaking on behalf of other SLO coordinators, they're just the amount of work that they have, or uh, the other resources that the budget's not in there. Uh, Other factors that play a role, right?
I worked at a community college where the resources weren't plentiful. And so we had
Mhm.
to use what was out there. Sometimes they were homegrown, sometimes they were pulled from other institutions. And so, yes, it does require some um, you, you have to know where those resources are to assist. Hopefully, there's peer institutions that will help you. I know that when I went to the Assessment Institute or some of the community colleges within the state, we got together to talk and share resources. Those were probably some of the most important pieces. What we also found in this work was that much of it's behind a password secured system. And so you might not have access to some of those resources as well. And so most, if they're open source, I think, and good resources, I love those for institutions that are under-resourced. But also if you can share some of those resources with others, that's incredibly important as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for questions. And I would also add, as I go back through here, um, after each cycle, institutions that receive the designation would then write up their story a little bit in the assessment update. If you're able to access these, I think these are really good ways to learn from the campuses themselves. They got a chance to talk about which parts of the which component of those 6 were hard, right? To explain. And then many of them really focused in on that use of student learning evidence and what they were able to show. You don't share the rubrics or the applications themselves. If institutions wanted to, they could. But this was designed for them to reflect on the process themselves and talk a little bit about, again, that evidence, using student evidence. Go ahead, Amanda.
This is a little bit of a segue, so I didn't want to interrupt the flow
No,
of thought
please.
if you had any more to talk about. You briefly touched on this, but I was hoping we could go a little bit more deeply. Is in this world of it's all about getting the passing grade and passing a class, how do we help encourage students and maybe for roles like us as LO coordinators, encourage faculty to help students see the importance of learning in itself? And I mean, that should equate hopefully to passing the class, but it's always something that's concerned me, especially in this world of AI and all of the other things, is what are some strategies or some conversations that you might encourage to have with students about just learning in itself and the importance of that? Was that too vague? I know that's not.
It's not vague. I think it just looks different, right? I just had a conversation with some grad students in a class, and I was explaining something to them, and they were like, "Oh, that's why that was on the syllabus," right? I would have thought before now they would have thought about some of those things, or at least had someone bring it to their attention, and maybe faculty have before, and they just didn't recognize it. I don't know, we keep coming up with different ideas about how we can help students understand why the importance of it, right? Faculty have been doing more in terms of trying to translate, what happens out in either employment or, whatever students are doing beyond that to they're happening and learning right now in the classroom. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not, but I think those repeated experiences. And if you're able to do that again in the classroom, outside of the classroom, I think if you're able to show students that you use their feedback to improve something and then come back and again and communicate to them, this is what happened, they're more than likely to really understand what it is that we're trying to do, as opposed to it just feeling so external, like you're just taking information from me all the time and I'm not seeing like what was the point of that. It's it's hard because it can't just happen one time. And potentially their K-12 experiences are different from what they're experiencing post-secondary. And so it doesn't look the same. But I think that's also what we are trying to find out. What are some of those ways that are effective for you? Like what's working with your students? If there is something that you find, absolutely share it with others, because it's hard. It is absolutely hard. And that's all students are different.
Mhm. One of the conversations I find myself repeatedly having on the campus is faculty say a lot, I'm preparing students for the real world, and it's one of my pet peeves. It really sincerely is. And so my rebuttal always is, how about you change the conversation into, let's talk about the real world skills that you have, that you are excelling at, that you can apply and excel in the classroom, because there's so many things. And it was a coach that helped me to see this, that the students that are out on the athletic fields, they know hard work. They know how to apply those skills. It's helping them see that these things, you just need to put it to work in the classroom. It's things that that are important. And so what are your thoughts on those types of strategies and those types of conversations?
It's absolutely it. There's a part in here that was just next, right? Because you got to think about how we move forward. And in the current educational system, right, we have to be transparent. We have to tell students what it is that we're doing and why. What we learned from assessment, we're trying to take stock of what was happening around assessment throughout the pandemic. And that's exactly what came up, right? We have to be very clear to students so that they can make good decisions about how they navigate education. We have to be very intentional about who is aware of learning outcomes. Are students clear on why they're doing these assignments? Can we measure students on things that they weren't aware of, that they were being measured upon? Like, these are all questions that if we're not asking, we absolutely should be asking. And the transparency in learning and teaching project, right? It's been developed quite a while now and taken to a different institution, but if you're not doing something like that, why aren't you? Especially with what we know now, students need to see those clear pathways about why they're doing things. They're asking really good questions about, like you just said, what's the point of me doing this? And if you don't have an answer for it, you had better start thinking of that, because otherwise, again, we're not doing a good job in communicating the value of what we're providing to students, to the public, and they'll opt somewhere else to do something else. So great points. I think there's a lot of transparency efforts and initiatives. Obviously, the transparency framework was one that was thinking about assessment broadly at the institution, but it absolutely has to fall, integrate back to the classroom and vice versa. And so efforts like this, assignment design charrettes that we've hosted, and signature assignments, that conversation has been pushed up, thinking about high impact practices. Absolutely. There's so many efforts to be more transparent with our students that they have to be intentional. And I think once you start to write these things down and document them, you start to see the integration a bit better, hopefully. Really good questions. Other questions? I'll end with a quote by George. Why not? Why not? I really like what he says here as we think about transparency. Many institutional leaders have little experience talking publicly about data that represents the core of their school's performance, about what actually happens to students in classrooms, labs, studios, practice fields, and beyond. But with practice and patience, we will all get better at deciding what to measure, how to measure it, and using what we learn to improve the quality. It's true. I mean, we're better than where we were in 2008, right? We continue to know more. And as we know more, right? If you know more, you hopefully you're going to do better. And I think that we're starting to do even better for the students that we're serving. Just have to be patient with one another. We have to be willing to share, be collaborative. They have to include students in the process. We have to invite faculty into the conversation around assessment and say, what can we learn from each other and how can we help you build on your practice? And if we come at it from that angle, we absolutely not only improve assessment practice, but ultimately, right, we're much more transparent about what we're doing as a whole, not just as an institution, but as a whole in post-secondary education. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're right at time. I always know I'm leaving a good talk when my tabs are completely full and I've got a whole nother list of reading things that I'm going to have to figure out how to fit in. So Dr. Baker, we appreciate your time and joining us for SLO Talk. To everybody else, these are always recorded and posted on our coach's blog. Follow us on LinkedIn and make sure and join us next week. So I thank you everybody for being here and I hope you have a wonderful Friday.
All right, thank you.